Okay, so data from African languages have played an important role in the advancement of theories of information structure, and it is well known that a number of West African languages display a variety of overt topic and focus markers. However, less attention has been given to East African languages, with some exceptions, of course, since many of those languages lack these overt markers. In this talk, however, we're going to provide an investigation of a dedicated topic position marked by the particle ko in Kipsigis, an Nilotic language spoken in Kenya. And you see an example of this in one. So here we see Kibet stole the money, and Kibet here is a topic that is at the left edge of the clause, and you see that it's followed by this ko marker that we have put in a box, and we're going to argue is a topic marker. And this is, to our knowledge, the first semantic study of topicalization in a Nilotic language. So on the empirical side, we're going to argue that the data show that topic markers might be more widespread in East African languages than previously thought. And to our knowledge, the only other documented case of an overt topic marker in East Africa is from the Bantu language Ruchiga. And also the data will support the typology of focus and topic in Ilman et al., where we have three different features: topic, focus, and contrast. Then we will look at the theoretical implications, and we're going to argue that the data point towards a unified analysis of contrastive and aboutness topics and provide evidence against analyzing contrastive topics in terms of focus. Okay, so here you can see a roadmap for the talk, and we're going to start with a brief overview of previous accounts of topichood. So Roberts, in an overview paper, describes two notions of topics in the literature. The first one is the subject matter of a text. And here the topic identifies the entity that the sentence is about and indicates where the information given in the sentence should be stored in the common ground. The second notion of topic is the subject matter of a discussion. And here the topic identifies a question under discussion, which is taken as a central organizing factor in discourse. So Roberts in the same paper provides a cross-linguistic overview, which suggests that these two notions should not be conflated and should receive independent theoretical modeling. And the motivation for this is that they seem to be expressed differently across languages. So we will start with aboutness topic. So an aboutness topic identifies the entity that the sentence is about, and this is often viewed as a file card in Heim's sense onto which the information contained in the sentence is entered. And this is also known as Valduvi's link. So let's see an example of how file cards work. So in 2, we have a man found a cat. He took the cat that he found home. And here, when a man is introduced, we create a file card where we enter the information. And with the cat, we create another file card where cat is entered. And then as the discourse progresses, like we update the file cards with information on these entities. Okay, so for example, we see in file card 1, we can update it by saying found 2, which would be the cat. And this way we see that the file cards can be linked and they can reference entities in other file cards. The entity-based view can also be implemented without postulating an independent level of information structure. And this has been done, for example, by Portner and Yabushita, who proposed that the common ground consists of a set of infinite sequences of pairs, where each pair consists of an entity, the link, and a set of possible worlds, which would be the information entered with respect to that link. Moving on to how aboutness topics are expressed cross-linguistically. Aboutness topics are unmarked in English, but they can receive morphological marking in other languages, most famously the Japanese wa marker. So a common way of eliciting aboutness topics is the tell me about X test, and you see concrete examples from English and Japanese in 3 and 4. So in 3, we have tell me about John, and then, well, John is a PhD student enrolled at the University of Lund, and here John is unmarked. But the similar, so a similar context in 4, tell me about that dog, where that dog is the topic, is marked by wa in Japanese. Since aboutness topics are perceived as entity denoting, certain types of arguments are predicted to not make good aboutness topics. Okay, so there are certain anti-topic elements that have been mentioned in the literature. So for example, Keys reports for Hungarian that only entity denoting and not quantificational MPs can appear in the designated topic position. And there have been similar claims for Japanese. For example, Tomioka identifies a class of MPs which cannot take the wa marker. And you see examples of those items in 5. So we see that the quantifiers can we scroll to 5? Okay, so everyone, anyone, someone, these are bad. And also these junctions cannot take the wa marker. So we see John or Bill, and this will become relevant later when we talk about Kipsigis. Okay, so moving on to contrastive topics. Contrastive topics often co-occur with another focus marked argument in the sentence, and that's why contrastive topic accounts often build on Ruth's alternative semantics for focus. So let's see what a common way of eliciting contrastive topics is. And we see that in 6, who ate what did Fred eat? So here we have a larger question, who ate what, and then the sub question, what did Fred eat? And in English, we'll get Fred ate the beans, where we have this fall rise contour, also called the B accent in the literature. So unlike aboutness topics, contrastive topics in English are marked by this dedicated intonation contour. In 7, we see a contrastive topic context from Japanese, and here the contrastive topic Erika is marked by wa. Okay, so for Japanese, we have the same marking for aboutness and contrastive topics. Now moving on to possible analysis of contrastive topics, based on Robert's discourse model, which takes the properties of topics to address the question under discussion, Bühring proposes that contrastive topics mark a discourse strategy. So what does this mean? A contrastive topic indicates an answer to a sub-question within a strategy aimed at addressing some larger issue. So this is illustrated with the D trees of the type that you see in 8. Okay, so here we have who ate what, which is the larger issue. And then we have the sub-questions, what did Fred eat, what did Mary eat, etc. And the answers to these sub-questions will give you the contrastive topic. Bühring connects the prosodic marking of the contrastive topic argument in English to a dedicated contrastive topic value. And this value creates a semantic object which is congruent with at least 2 sister sub-questions in a D tree, okay, which is what you see in 8. And in 9, you see a concrete example. So even though Bühring uses a dedicated contrastive topic value, there are other accounts that aim to derive similar semantic readings by making use of focus semantic values only, so not dedicated contrastive topic values. And we're going to talk about those later in the talk. Okay, so moving on to the data, we start with some basic information on Kipsigis clausal syntax so that you can better understand the data. So Kipsigis is the major variety of Kalenjin, which belongs to the Southern Nilotic branch of Nilo-Saharan. It's spoken in Kenya, and the data come from our fieldwork online and in Nairobi. The language is prodrop and verb initial, and it has a marked nominative case system. So what this means is that subjects are marked and everything else is unmarked, and case is expressed tonally. So you see an example of a simple sentence in 10. So we have Kibet stole the money, and here you see that stole, the verb is at the initial position in the sentence, and then we have the subject, which is marked with nominative, and the subject can be dropped because it's prodrop. Okay, so even though the default or pragmatically neutral word order is VSO, which is what you see in 10, there is extensive scrambling post-verbally, and we mention this data because they are important for information structure. So what you see in 11 is that if we have a sentence like Kibet stole the money yesterday, where we have a subject, an object, and an adverb, as long as the verb is in the initial position, the relative order of the post-verbal elements is somewhat free. Okay. And Bossi and Dirks argue that scrambling is discourse-based in the language, and they argue that discourse-prominent elements occupy the immediately post-verbal position. So what this means is that if you look at 11, in A, where the subject immediately follows the verb, that would be the most prominent element in the discourse. In B, we have the object immediately following the verb. In C, we have the adverb immediately following the verb. So we're going to skip here their syntactic analysis and talk a little bit more about what the semantics of that position is. And they show that focused items most naturally occupy this immediately post-verbal position. So if you have focus in the sentence, it will most likely appear in that position. So this is illustrated in 12 with a question-answer pair. So WH words usually appear in the immediately post-verbal position, as you see in the question, what did Kibet eat, right? So here we have what immediately after the verb. And answers to WH questions also appear in that position. So Kibet ate ugali, here ugali, which is our answer, will be immediately after the verb. However, they say that focused elements are not the only elements that appear in that position, and that's why they opt for the more general discourse prominence notion. But focused elements like being in that position. Okay, so now we're moving on to the co-position, which is the focus of the talk. So even though the language is verb initial, there is one pre-verbal position in the language marked by the particle co. So in 13a, we see the basic VSO order, okay, ate, Kibet, ugali. But we see that you can also have the order in B, where we have Kibet, Ko, 8 Ugali. And in C, we see that the object can also be in this topic position. So Ugali, Ko, 8 Kibet. Okay. So one important syntactic property of this position is that it is restricted to nominals. So what you see in 14 is that adverbs cannot occupy the co-position. So we cannot have slowly ko drives Kibet, and PPs can also not occupy the co-position. So with Kiplangat ko, Kibet made food is not okay. We also observe that there is a case alternation for subject. So if we go back to 13, we see that in A, where the subject follows the verb, the subject is marked for nominative, but when the subject precedes the verb, it is unmarked for case. However, the co-marker is not a case marker, so it does not attach to the noun, and in fast speech, it actually criticizes on the verb, and also usually case in the language is marked tonally, not by affixes. Okay, so ko really marks the position. You never see ko anywhere else. Okay, and it's not a case marker. For those interested in the syntax side of things, there's also a V2 effect. So what this means is that if we have a preverbal position, we can only ever have one noun preceding the verb, never two nouns. And syntactically, the position has many similarities to the preverbal position in Dinka, which is also nilotic. Okay. Now, moving on to the interpretation of the position, what we will argue is that it marks topics. So the most salient interpretation of nouns in that position is that of a contrastive topic. So in 17, you see a contrastive topic context. We were at an event with many other people attending, and multiple dishes such as beans were available. Who ate what? Who ate beans? Who ate meat? And an appropriate answer to this context is the sentences are the sentences that you see in A and B. So beans, ko ate Kibet. Meat, ko, ate Chebet. Okay, so this is a contrastive topic interpretation. There is further evidence that the interpretation there is that of a contrastive topic. So for example, the position is not licensed in the context of an exhaustive answer. So you see that in 18, so we have who won the race. And if you want to answer Kibet won the race, you cannot do it by putting Kibet in the co-position. Similarly, the position is infelicitous in the maximal element context. So we see in 19, which train did they take? And here you can answer by saying some ko took the first train, but you cannot answer by all ko took the first train. And so these are contexts that have been claimed to be incompatible with contrastive topics. And this is borne out in Kipsigis. However, the contrastive topic interpretation is not the only possibility, and aboutness topics are also possible. So all consultants offer the sentence in 20 when we give them a tell me about X context. Okay, so here we have the context, tell me about Samantha, and the most natural answer in this case is Samantha Ko lives in Nairobi. Okay, so now Imke is going to talk about the theoretical implications.
Yeah, so clearly what seems to be the challenge concerning the co-marker and Kipsigis is the double function of co-signaling aboutness and contrastive topics. So these two topic types diverge substantially in terms of the empirical picture, but also conceptually. And take the Japanese wa marking, for example, right? So we saw that there's this wa position and the marker for aboutness topics as well as contrastive topics, at least claimed by some authors, but a fully unified analysis is rarely proposed in the literature. So this seems to be a challenge, and it will also be a challenge for Kipsigis, of course, because it patterns is like Japanese in this respect. And while we have not fully developed analysis yet, I think we are ready to make some points concerning the data and distinguishing between different types of different theories of topichood. So the first problem we want to point out for an entity-based account is based on a prediction it makes with respect to what makes a good aboutness topic. So recall that quantified and disjunctive NPs cannot really serve as good topics in Hungarian and Japanese, but they can in Kipsigis, right? So look at 21, Kibet or Chebet ate ugali, that's fine in the co-position. And so are quantified NPs. So all children ate ugali, and 22 is fine, every child her friend saw, also fine in the co-position. And the one quantifier, age, that does make a difference between whether it needs a contrastive reading or an aboutness reading, is something we haven't really have an account of yet. Yeah, so it's shown in 24. So there we do see a sensitivity to contrastive readings, but it's just one of the minor differences. Right, so we think an entity-based account might not really fit because we do have anti-topic phrases that seem to still be okay in the co-position. Now, the next thing we want to point out is that Co does not signal a nested focus structure. This has been proposed by Wagner, and he proposes a focus operator that can take topics and foci as arguments. So here it's instructive to look at an example. So let's look at 25. Fred ate the beans. So that would be licensed in a contrastive topic context. So who ate what? What did Fred eat? Fred ate the beans, right? So Wagner says that you have the beans is F marked and Fred is F marked. Yeah, and focus operators are introduced in the left periphery and they each attract the F marked phrase. And they create this nested focus structure, right? And the focus operator then, each of the focus operators presupposes that alternatives to the F marked phrase must be salient, where each occurrence introduces its own presuppositions. And the presuppositions are given in 25B and C. So the inner focus says that a set Y such that Fred ate Y is salient, and there's an alternative to beans other than beans. And then the outer focus presupposes that a set XY such that X ate Y is salient, and there's an alternative to Fred other than Fred. And that gives you the licensing of contrastive topics. Now, Wagner argues that simple focus structures can be derived by the single application of the focus operator. And here we see a problem for Kipsigis because assuming that Co spells out the focus operator, we make the wrong prediction here because we observe that focused elements are consistently infelicitous in the co-position. They are, for example, infelicitous as answers to WH questions. That's what you can see in 26, who ate beans? Kibet ate beans here. Here, Kibet cannot show up in the co-position. And neither can WH phrases show up in the co-position or only mark phrases. And in 29, we see a correction context where speaker A says Kibet is sleeping, and then speaker B corrects A saying, no, Kibet is sleeping. And again, Kibet cannot be in the co-position. So these are all bona fide focus scenarios, and they seem to be blocked in the co-position. And this is probably a very solid argument against a Wagner style account, because we would expect if Co spells out the focus operator, it could also just license single focus structures. In section 5.3, we get to the gist of the problem. So there are a variety of topic theories out there that focus on the derivation of contrastive topics. And we want to zoom in to two such theories. One is Bühring 2003 and the other one is Constant 2014. And the gist of this section is just to tell you that these contrastive topic theories cannot extend to aboutness contexts. But this is something we want for Kipsigis. Right, so Bühring introduces this CT value for contrastive topics. This is a new semantic dimension, similar to how Ruth introduces a focus semantic value for F-mark constituents, in addition to the ordinary semantic values. And then CT values get mapped to 4 rise contours on PF, similar to how F values are argued to get mapped to pitch accents. So this is how he gets the special intonation for contrastive topics. And then CT values are calculated by an algorithm that is run here on an example in 30. So Fred ate the beans, right? We have a contrastive topic scenario. First, we replace the F-mark phrases with variables, and that gets us Fred ate Y. Basically, the question, what did Fred eat? And then in the second step, we replace the CT mark phrases with variables, and that gets us a set of questions. What did Fred eat? What did Mary eat? Or you can say a set of propositions. And this semantic object here has to be congruent with a part of a D tree, and that's also written into Bühring's theory. And this is how you can license contrastive topics. The account in Constant 2014 derives the same semantic object here for contrastive topics, but by positing a topic abstraction operator. So it gets you the same facts, but with slightly different tools. So as in Wagner, both contrastive topics and foci are simply F-marked, but it is the contrastive topic that obligatory raises to trigger topic abstraction. So here's an example, 31, Fred ate the beans. Yeah, again, so here we have F marking, but we see that the contrastive topic thread raises and triggers the insertion of this topic abstraction operator. And this operator adds a nesting layer in the focus dimension by abstracting over alternative sets, right? So the alternative set here is given in one. So we have the trace here of threads. So G of 1 ate the beans, G of 1 ate the eggplant. We vary here the slot in the object position because it's F marked. Then we do something that looks very similar to predicate abstraction, but also slightly different, right? And then the crucial thing is here that the output is a set of propositions, X ate the beans, X ate the eggplant. Now, if we combine 2 with the F-marked phrase thread via pointwise functional application, we get 3, right? Again, a set of propositions, exactly what Bühring also gets with his analysis. And then you have to make that somehow find an antecedent in the discourse. Okay, so far so good. What's important here is that both Bühring and Constant treat contrastive topics separately from focus. So assuming that Co either spells out the contrastive, a topic abstraction operator, or it attaches to a CT valued phrase, this derives why focus phrases cannot occur in the co-position, right? So they treat this as something else, which is good. It's a good result, but neither account can be extended to aboutness topics, which we know in Kipsigis trigger the co-construction as well. So this has led many in the field to search for syntactic differences between aboutness and contrastive topics in languages where both topics are realized in a similar fashion on the surface. For example, like in Japanese. And then in Japanese, what is actually claimed in literature is that contrastive topics show properties of movement. For example, they would obey islands, while aboutness topics do not. We tested this in Kipsigis. We give you here 2 islands in 32 and 33. One is a complex NP island, the other one is an adjunct island, and the topicalized phrase originates in the island, and we see that there's ungrammaticality independent of the topic type. Yeah, those are just out independent of the context, right? So they look very similar syntactically. And the other similarity we find is that the co-position is restricted to nominals, again, independent, irrespective of the type of the topic. So adverbs and PPs are ungrammatical. There is one exception here with this particular PP for a subset of speakers. So there, and this is given in detail here in 34, we do want a contrastive reading only for these. So we summarize here these exceptions, the small difference we find between contrastive and aboutness topics under these 2 bullet points. So one is this special PP, and the other one is the AG quantifier that we already talked about, right? So we don't really know why these differences exist, but all in all, we observe that these two constructions, the 2 readings of the topic phrases, they seem to have very similar syntax, maybe even identical syntax. Okay. Now, in order to account for aboutness topics and contrastive topics uniformly, we need a theory that covers both constructions and ideally links the 2 via some common element. And actually one such theory is given in von Fintel. And we want to run you through the von Fintel analysis and propose in the end that this might be suitable for Kipsigis. So von Fintel proposes that topics are licensed by an operator, which is built on the semantics proposed by the squiggle operator that licenses focus phrases. First, we're going to explain to you what the squiggle does, because then it's easier to understand what the topic operator does. So the purpose of the squiggle operator is to connect alternative sets produced by F marking to a discourse antecedent. And this mediation is done by a covert variable C. So you have here an example of a single focus sentence, John saw Mary. That would be felicitous in a context answering a question like, who did John see? Yeah, and what you see here is that the squiggle introduces the C variable. And C has to be, so the squiggle says C has to be a subset of the input of the squiggle. The input of a squiggle is the F value of 1. Yeah, so that would be John saw Mary, John saw Sue. Mary is F marked, that's why we vary the constituents in the object slot. So now the squiggle says this C now has to be a subset of this set, right? So this is what we show you here in 2. And under the assumption that C denotes a question like, who did John see? then via the Hamling denotation, this C actually constitutes a subset of the set John saw Mary, John saw Sue. So all this means is that focus is licensed if C is anaphoric to a question, who did John see? Yeah, that's a good result. So for topics, von Vinte proposes a double squiggle operator, which also introduces an anapher that has to find the discourse antecedent. So, and it can be defined as in 37 roughly, right? Given a sentence topic associated with an expression alpha, double squiggle introduces this anapher C into the context, whose value is constrained to be a subset of the set of propositions of the form alpha p's, and alpha now is the ordinary semantic value. The most unmarked situation would be that this is precisely the discourse topic at this point. Okay, so here's how von Vinte derives aboutness topics. John saw Mary, right? So that could be licensed in a context where the question is, what about John? This is a variant of the tell me about X context, we think. And here we see that the double squiggle attaches directly to the topic phrase, introduces a C variable. C has to be a subset of a set of the form alpha p's. So a set of propositions such that there's a property applied to John, right? So that could be John saw Mary, John went home, John hates linguistics, all kinds of P that can be associated with John. Now, under the assumption that C denotes a question like, what about John? That question under the Hamlet denotation is a subset of John saw Mary, John went home, etc. So they are identical, so that's fine. Now, crucially, and this is important for Kipsigis, the topic operator is also found in von Vintel's work for the derivation of contrastive topics, right? So, and what we do there is just we have the combination of a double squiggle, a single squiggle, and two F-mark phrases. So, John ate pasta, right? So this is licensed in a context that would have a larger issue, who ate what? And maybe the sub-question, what about John, right? So these two questions have to be found in the discourse. So we have C1 here. This is basically what we did with the aboutness context in 38, right? So C1 has to be a subset of a set, the alpha p's, right? So that again is John ate pasta, John went home, etc. C1 is a subset of this under the assumption that it denotes a question like, what about John? Right? So far, so good, it's the same. Now for the larger issue, right, we look at the single squiggle and at C2. So C2 has to be a subset of a set of propositions because this node here denotes contains is a multi-focus contraction, right? So that would be licensed if C2 denotes something like who ate what. And again, we derive the right scenario. Okay. So what we found now is long story short, we have found an analysis, a theory that has a common core between aboutness topics and contrastive topics, and something that could potentially spell out co. That was the point of the whole thing. Okay. Okay, so quickly concluding, the fact that quantifiers and disjunctions can serve as topics points against an entity-based theory of topichood in Kipsigis. The fact that focus phrases are illicit in the composition excludes analyses of contrastive topic as nested focus structures, since the corpus construction is seemingly identical in aboutness and contrastive context. This calls for an analysis where a component is shared across aboutness and contrastive topic configurations, and that would be one that von Vinte proposes. And basically, what we want to tentatively assume here is that co spells out this double squiggle operator. We have a couple of loose ends here that we didn't really get to talk about, but since it's already 8:04, we stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so feel free to raise your hands or to type in the chat. Sarah.
Thank you for this talk. This was fun. I have a small comment on the argument from quantificational determiners, and so let me start with that. So I do think we know, I think from the cross-linguistic literature now, that there's actually very few true quantificational determiners, right? So it could be very well that you have plurality denoting expressions there that are allowed, or a specific indefinite or something that is ultimately E-type denoting. And given that this expression here translates to all, right? That would be one way of also explaining that data potentially, saying that this is actually not a true quantificational expression. So just something to think about. If you have time, I would be curious if you've looked at association with focus sensitive particles, right? I think that could constitute another argument against an analysis as focus marking, because then it should be able to associate with exclusives or additive scalar particles and such.
So you wanna? No, you go.
Well, I can start, and so maybe if you scroll to the loose ends, there is a distinction. So the behavior depends on the type of particle that you have. So with only, and there are at least 2 or 3 particles that, well, at least two particles that seem to be translated, as only in English. These are always impossible in the composition for all speakers. But scalars and additives behave differently.
Cool.
This is also common cross-linguistically, especially in African languages, that they will not associate to focus in the same way. And you can see here the examples. Maybe Imke can, Do you want to say something, Imke?
So this is the part we haven't figured out yet. We don't really feel confident implementing. So we're still sorting through the data also. Well, one, there's a subject-object asymmetry. So even phrases in subject position attracted to the co-position, they don't want to be anywhere else. So that's the difference between 45A and 45B and C. For objects, this is different. So for objects, they can also be post-verbally. So first of all, we're not sure how to account for this distinction. And of course now, so this has been analyzed as a difference between free association and conventional association with focus. So that means either it's encoded in the lexical entry or it relates to the C variable. And I mean, so what we have in the contrastive topics scenario is that we don't have a C variable introduced by a squiggle. So maybe that explains it, but then you kind of have to make a difference between C1 and C2, and so the C that is introduced by a single squiggle and the C that's introduced by a double squiggle. So we don't really see how exactly this will work, but.
Have you looked at this paper by Manfred Krifgas on focus particles and how they associate with the topics? I'm sure, very early SALT paper, but the fact that it's the additives and the scalar one that can co-occur, I think that does remind me of that paper and the data discussed from German there. So maybe something,
And there are data also from other African languages. So Malte Zimmermann talks about this in various papers. So in Hausa, Bura, Ngamo, in work together with Grubic. So it seems to be the case that in those languages that have dedicated focus marking, it's common that scalars, additives and additive scalars will not have that focus marking. And also there are theories that they draw a connection between contrastive topics and scalars. So we thought of those. So this is, Malte Zimmermann has worked, but also Greenberg. But what is not clear for the Kipsigis data is that in those theories, subject even NPs are not really discussed. They talk more about, the objects. And then this is the surprising case in Kipsigis where subjects have to be in the composition when you have a scalar particle. And that's the thing that, we're not sure how to deal with, the subject-object asymmetry. And
Thank you.
Okay, so Natasha had a note in the chat, some recommending to SALT papers. Mitchell has a question.
Yes, thank you. This is great. I was wondering if you've looked also at all of these behaviors in embedded clauses. And that's just an open-ended question. I think it would be worth doing. And there are reasons why, but I'm curious if you've looked at that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we know we should do that. So we haven't really done it systematically. I mean, the only thing we can say is that the composition is definitely licensed in some embedded contexts, at least, so with verbs like know or think, we have the data and you can have it in the composition, but we haven't investigated, different types of embedded contexts and then, different interpretations, I guess, that you could have. So we haven't done that yet. Yeah.
But so we do know that Co can attract phrases long distance, or we're fairly sure about this?
Yes, but I think, yes, I guess there are two different questions, right? So one is whether you can get Co in an embedded context when it's embedded under something else. Yeah, that's what, So, but yes, there's also the other thing that we didn't mention, the long distance profile. So that also we haven't really looked at cases. So all the examples in this handout are, from the clause bound, basically. But we do know that it can be long distance, and there we haven't looked also at the exact interpretation. Yeah, not yet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was unclear. A couple things just to volunteer, a couple things maybe worth looking out for. So one is, since there was some Japanese in the comparison, in Japanese, it's quite striking that in embedded clauses, it's for some authors impossible, or some authors very difficult to get the aboutness topic interpretation. So in embedded clauses, whenever you use wa, it has to become contrastive topic, and that's quite striking. But then also the Dinka connection that you had made me wonder whether movement through that position is that also basically making use of some clause peripheral position that all other A-bar movement moves through as well, in which case you might get other kinds of competition if you have other, for example, inside relative clauses, say, maybe this position doesn't exist, right? That kind of thing would be the kind of thing we might imagine.
That actually holds. So those data like we do have, so you don't get them. You don't get the position in relative clauses. Yeah. But yes, thanks. Yeah, there are also a lot of syntactic things to look at for sure. That's what Imke and I want to do next, because we think it's interesting that there is this connection to Dinka, because they're very similar, but also there are interesting differences. For example, you don't have agreement, right, between the whatever is there. And also it's not V2, it's not obligatorily filled. Sometimes you see the position in the right discourse context, but usually the language is verb initial. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that concludes this session of 2 talks. And we're gonna have a 20-minute break, 19-minute break. So see you guys in 19 minutes.